Welcome to the debate and the special transmission on the 17th extraordinary session of the Council of Foreign Ministers of the Organization of Islamic Countries. I'm your host, Maqbool, and of course with me is Mr. Farrukh, Pitafi and Raja Faisal. We have been hosting a special transmission on PTV WORLD, and part of the show debate, of course, is also dedicated to this very extraordinary session that is happening in Pakistan. This is extremely important with regards to the situation in Afghanistan. We all know that Pakistan has always spoken about how it is extremely necessary that there is peace in Afghanistan. And now, considering the humanitarian and economic collapse that Afghanistan is facing at the moment, it is quite urgent and important that such steps need to be taking place. What is more important, of course, is that we get something out of this conference, which of course helps the people of Afghanistan. That is the aim. This is going to be a very important session that is going to be held tomorrow. We have a large number of delegates from many different countries who are participating in this extraordinary session, and the hope, of course, is that real issues are going to be discussed. The priority, of course, is to avert the humanitarian and economic collapse in Afghanistan, to help bring aid to the country. We're, of course, expecting difficult discussions to be held as to how much money is needed in Afghanistan, how that money is going to be trickled down to the people in Afghanistan, what is going to be the mechanism for that. Is there going to be any discussion on the recognition of the Taliban regime? Is the Taliban government in Afghanistan going to consider the commitments that it has made earlier to make this process easier? All of these are, of course, very difficult questions. But then again, this is why we have this conference taking place and a number of countries and delegates getting together, sitting on the table to work a way forward. And we are very happy to be able to host this conference in Pakistan. We will be discussing in further detail what exactly will be the outcome of this session, what sort of issues need to be brought to the forefront, and what discussions need to be taken. And then, of course, the kind of measures that need immediate attention and that can be taken in the short term to help the situation in Afghanistan. And then, of course, the longer term measures that can be taken and whether we can chalk out a plan or not for peace in Afghanistan in the future. We will also be joined by our respected guests online to further discuss this session and the situation in Afghanistan, and of course the complications with this issue that need to be addressed. We have been joined by Mr. Andrei Kortunov. He's the Director General of Russian International Affairs Council. And we've also been joined by Michael Kugelman, who's the Deputy Director, Asia Program and Senior Associate for South Asia at the Wilson Center. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being with us in the show, The Debate. Of course, the OIC's extraordinary session of the Council of Foreign Ministers is extremely important, and all eyes are on the outcome of this session and whether or not something real is going to come out in terms of change in the situation in Afghanistan. I'll start with you, Mr. Michael Kugelman. We've discussed Afghanistan many times in the debate as well, and the situation, of course, is one that requires urgent attention by the world. This seems to be an important step in the right direction, but what are your expectations from this session? Do you think that we, once the session is over, will see a way forward?
Well, I certainly hope so. As you say, there is so much urgency right now. We all know how bad humanitarian crisis has become in Afghanistan. And I do hope that this meeting, a group of foreign ministers representing the Muslim world, will be well placed to come to some type of consensus leading to concrete, impactful recommendations to move forward. I think there's hope that these are the types of countries that would be able to relate to the Taliban and could be influential over the Taliban just because they do represent members of the Muslim world. And I think that the key here is to not just come up with a plan to deliver more food supplies. That's important as well. But clearly the need at this point is to go further than that because the entire economy in Afghanistan is poised to collapse. So what I would hope is that there will be some discussions at this summit about other ways to help Afghanistan and its economy beyond mere humanitarian aid. And that could involve perhaps discussions on how to provide funds to the Afghan public sector, particularly the health and education sectors, to help pay the salaries of employees, including school teachers. And also, I hope that there will be some discussion about how to generate some funds that can be provided to some of the reputable banks in Afghanistan, particularly the central bank, to ease the liquidity crisis that Afghanistan is experiencing. These are wealthy countries, or the OIC members, many of them are wealthy countries. They have the capital. They have the ability to put a plan together with funds separate from what the West is up to, and of course we know that there's this very strong sanctions policy in place. So I don't want to. I don't think we should have outsized expectations, because too often enough you have these big meetings and they result in these nice-sounding statements and nothing happens. But I do think that you have the right countries at place here, and of course there also will be representation from the U.S. and from the EU, and that's important as well. But I think that the OIC can be impactful here in ways that some of the groupings of the Western countries may not be. But the key is there has to be something that goes beyond just more platitudes about wanting to help and delivering more humanitarian supplies. It needs to go further than that at this point.
Right. Michael, with your permission, Sana. Michael, when you're going to evaluate the outcome, how are you going to grade it? What are the nodal points that you're looking at? Money is one thing. Is recognition the next one?
I don't think that I don't think discussions about recognition will figure prominently in this summit, just because it seems that the world has concluded that it's possible to engage with the Taliban and try to pursue goals, particularly in terms of easing the humanitarian crisis, without recognizing the Taliban. And the Taliban itself may want recognition from the world, but I think that there's a clear realization that there's so much space for engagement and getting things done, that the issue of recognition, I think, has become somewhat abstract at this point. And I think that the goal would be to push that off for discussions later. I think the initial goal will be on financial support, economic support, and that, again, does not need to relate to the political issues about recognition.
Mr. Andre, when we talk about what Michael started off with saying, what he hopes for is to be able to reach some sort of a consensus on the issue. Of course, this is a very extremely difficult thing to achieve. But of course, we hope that, considering that there is a humanitarian issue at stake, there may be a consensus regarding the need to do something about that. Will that be the case? Do you think that there can be some sort of a consensus to help the people in Afghanistan? Because even that seems complicated at the moment.
I agree. I think that even this is quite complicated, and within the organization of Islamic States, there are different views on Afghanistan, on what is legitimate and what is not, what is fair, what is not, and where we should draw the red lines for Taliban. It's not even about recognition, it's about dealing with Taliban at large. Definitely there is no consensus, but I think that it is possible, if not to bridge the gaps in perceptions, then at least to narrow the gaps and to come up with a consolidated position. And of course, OIC might be a user-friendly interface between Taliban and the rest of the global community. It definitely has more legitimacy in Kabul than many other countries. And at the same time, I think it might present the positions of the global community on the red lines that Taliban should not cross in dealing with gender issues or minority rights or inclusive government, things like that. And I would agree with Michael that there are two dimensions which are equally important. There is this immediate dimension, how to help Taliban go through this winter, and how to meet the multiple shortcomings, especially for large urban areas like Kabul and other big cities, in terms of food and fuel and medicines. But there is the other agenda, which is also very important, how to relaunch the Afghan economy and how to make sure that Afghanistan becomes an attractive place for foreign investment. Because they're talking a lot about foreign investment in Afghanistan, about natural resources that the country possesses, about the country conveniently located at the international trade crossroads. But we should keep in mind that unless there is a sound economic strategy in Afghanistan, it cannot survive on humanitarian assistance forever. It should develop
That's a very
its
good
own.
point. So you were talking about narrowing the differences between OIC and Afghanistan or Taliban. Can you identify what those differences might be?
Well, I think that some countries tend to take a more rigid approach. For example, if you take Iran, they are particularly concerned about religious minorities, about Shia in Afghanistan, which are not properly represented right now in the Taliban government. You look at Central Asian countries, and they are more concerned about Pakistan, about the Taliban not being able to suppress the activities of ISIS-K in the north part of the country. So I think that each neighbor of Afghanistan, each country which has connections to Afghanistan has its own list of priorities, a list of concerns and expectations. And we've got to come to a common denominator, and maybe the meeting which takes place right now is going to bring us there.
Yes,
Michael,
Faisal.
I had a question. Now when we have the OIC humanitarian office in Kabul, it is ready to, engage with the world organizations, obviously including United Nations and the other countries as well. Whoever, do not want to directly engage with the Kabul government, the Taliban government, then of course they have an option of OIC humanitarian office based in Kabul, which is going to be effective. And do you think that they will be willing to engage with the OIC humanitarian office instead of the Taliban to send the aid and send the humanitarian aid to the people of Afghanistan?
Yeah, well, here is where I think you have some of the types of difference in views that Andre had mentioned before within the OIC. Certainly, some members of the OIC would be more comfortable engaging directly with the Taliban, including providing financial assistance directly to the Taliban, than other members would be. I think that's quite clear, and that sort of underscores, indeed, I agree with Andre, how difficult it will be to develop a consensus. And the fact that you have one of the world's great geopolitical rivalries ensconced in this group, the Iran-Saudi Arabia rivalry, of course, that's going to make it very difficult. But to underscore what I had said before, there are options at play that would allow countries to provide assistance to Afghanistan beyond mere humanitarian assistance that would not necessarily have to go through the Taliban. If you devise mechanisms to deliver funding to people, bureaucrats, not Taliban, bureaucrats, civil servants that work for the government as school teachers or as technocrats or whatever the case may be, to provide salaries to them, theoretically that should not have to go through the Taliban. And of course, the challenge is to ensure that the Taliban does not get in.
And Michael, that is a fascinating proposition. But I want to understand what kind of mechanism there might be. Earlier, when Faisal was talking about humanitarian office of OIC, I understand that unlike the UN organization, they don't have that kind of roots in Afghanistan. So at this moment, going through Afghan Taliban might be the easy route. When you talk about actually NGOs coming over and paying off to the bureaucrats, do we have any precedent of the kind, or there'll have to be some new mechanism that will have to be devised?
Yes, no, absolutely. And you're right. I think that there's much more trust in some of these more established groups like the UN and its affiliate organizations like the World Food Program and so forth. That's certainly the types of groups that the West is more comfortable dealing with. But Afghanistan needs as much help as it can get. So if there is some type of hope for this new humanitarian cell of the OIC to be positioned in Kabul assisting, that would be important. And certainly the Taliban would have no problems with that. But again, the question is, do you engage with the Taliban or do you not? That is the big question. And some of these countries in this group will not want to do that. They'll be more uncomfortable than others will be.
Right, absolutely. And Mr. Andre, building on that, of course, when we talk about a mechanism, it's extremely important because even if there is money that is pledged, what really needs to be discussed is how that money is then going to trickle down to the people in Afghanistan. Whatever the mechanism may be or whatever are the possibilities, are they actually being considered by the countries as part of this OIC session? Do you think that the countries may actually be able to talk about something or even want to go there regardless of issues of inclusivity or recognition, and whether or not the commitments by the Taliban are actually fulfilled? Will they still be willing to engage in devising a mechanism so that aid can be distributed?
Well, my take is, of course, in the end of the day, some of these mechanisms have to be approved by the United Nations Security Council. But I think that OIC might be a very powerful lobbyist for particular proposals and ideas that can later on be subject to discussions within the Security Council. Now, let me give you an example. The example of Syria. There are many donors, and there are still many international donors that would like to assist the Syrian people, but that feel very uncomfortable working through and with Damascus. So in 2020, the United Nations Security Council has approved a resolution allowing these institutions to operate directly through the Turkish-Syrian border and to help avoiding a humanitarian disaster in the province of Idlib. I don't want to make direct comparisons between Syria and Afghanistan. Of course, these are two very different cases, but there are some precedents when international organizations can operate directly, even bypassing the central government of the recipient country. So I don't exclude that such precedents might be considered for Afghanistan as well.
Right, but you were talking about food and supplies, right? We are talking about paying salaries to the medical staff of hospitals who might be who have been actually, they have inherited from the previous government. So is there any precedent of that sort, Andre?
Well, I think that the question is how we distinguish between humanitarian and technical assistance on the one hand and reconstruction on the other. I recall it was an issue in Iraq, and it was resolved more or less satisfactorily. It related not just to basic food supplies, but to rebuilding the public infrastructure in the country. So if there is political will, there is a way to go along this way. And of course, the needs in Afghanistan are very, very significant. And I think that whoever is ready to render assistance should be in a position to find a particular format of doing that.
That's a great point, and it is heartening to hear as well. But simultaneously, we cannot factor out the reality that Taliban are there. And if the world community is undercutting their authority, is it not going to complicate the situation?
Well, I think that here it depends on whether Taliban can provide security, safety for international organizations willing to operate in the country, whether there are no obstacles, no restrictions. And definitely it is not easy for Taliban because they have their own ideology and their own modes of operation. But if they are concerned about the situation in their own country, they should be in a position to compromise. It's clear.
Right, but yes, Faisal.
Yeah, Michael, I just wanted to ask, earlier this week, of course, Pakistan announced that if somebody does not want to directly engage with the Kabul government or Kabul, then the international organizations and the other countries as well, they can engage Kabul through Islamabad, and Islamabad is open about it, that Islamabad will, help out all of the countries who are willing to help the people of Afghanistan. Do you think that there are obviously few of the countries who do not trust Pakistan, and in the recent times they have been showing the mistrust towards Pakistan. Do you think that they will be coming forward and trying to talk to Pakistan and through Pakistan send the aid?
Well, it's a good point. Certainly, you will have some countries, including those within the OIC, that would not be comfortable working with Pakistan in that context. But I think on the whole, this is another reason why OIC is advantageous in this context. There would not be the mistrust of Pakistan that you have with many countries in the West when it comes to Pakistan and its role in Afghanistan and its relationship with the Taliban. So I think this could be an opportunity for the OIC countries. But I think it's an important point, which I think you referred to, that the international aid groups and the UN groups, the World Food Program, they have been very open and candid about the fact that they are perfectly they are perfectly willing to work with the Taliban because there's simply no other alternative. I mean, you've heard senior officials from these groups, from the World Food Program and other UN agencies, saying, well, look, we don't have any other choice. We may not agree with what the Taliban has been doing over the years, but we have to work with them because there's no other choice. The more they say that, the more that may cause some of the countries that are very hesitant to engage with the Taliban be more receptive to that idea of at least seeing these aid agencies working directly with them. Many countries in the West, including the U.S., there's domestic political factors, domestic political risks, I think, that make them reluctant to look more favorably at this idea of engaging with the Taliban.
Right.
The OIC countries, that's not a factor.
Right. And from what you are saying, Michael, I garnered that you are saying that there are countries which tacitly at least agree that Afghan Taliban are a reality. So is it not a step towards recognizing them? Why invent a new precedent and create a new system rather than actually working with what you have got?
True.
Because otherwise I see the problem of verification, and every answer you give me takes me back to cigar reports, where NGOs and the US investment actually fell through the cracks.
True.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there is there's this, I'll just put it this way. The reality is the Taliban is here to stay for now. We don't know how long it'll be around. It may struggle to consolidate its power, but in the here and now, as we look at this reality of nearly the entire country being plunged into poverty in the coming months, and looking at the fact that 25 million people could be on their way to starvation in the coming months, according to the World Food Program, what are the other options, right? Who are the other interlocutors on the ground that can be dealt with? And it's true that there are theoretically ways to go further than humanitarian assistance that don't necessarily entail putting money directly in the hands of the Taliban. There's always that risk that if you try to develop a mechanism to deliver financing to, say, the health sector and the education sector so that doctors and teachers can be paid, you can't rule out the possibility that the Taliban will somehow get some of that money. But the question is that a risk worth bearing at this point? I think it is, given how serious the humanitarian crisis is. And that's I think an important way to look at this from a very basic risk-benefit analysis.
But of course, whether or not the different countries actually look at it the same way, or for them, if this risk-benefit analysis is the same as we are looking at it, is the real question, whether or not they're going to go forward with that. I also want to explore the role that Pakistan is playing in further detail with regards to how the world is viewing it. Of course, as Faisal mentioned, this has been something that has been spoken about in the past, but Pakistan has always tried to speak about how peace is important, and has always been an important facilitator in that regard. With the OIC happening, and Pakistan also clarifying that it's not a spokesperson for the Taliban. It, of course, only wants to be able to bring everybody on the table for negotiation. Mr. Andre, do you think it is clear to the people participating in the session or to the world at large that Pakistan, this difference between Pakistan being a spokesperson, Pakistan being a facilitator, is clear, that Pakistan's role here is only as a peace facilitator?
True.
Well, I think that there is no consensus on this issue, of course, and if you go to New Delhi, for example, they would look very suspiciously about the role of Pakistan in the Afghan situation, and they would probably argue that Pakistan is behind the most radical groups of Taliban, which, of course, is not really the case. There is a competition about influence in Afghanistan, and Pakistan stands out as one of the most important countries, one of the most important players in the Afghan situation. So you should be ready to observe many prejudices and many assumptions about the intentions of Pakistan. But in the end of the day, I think the actions of Pakistan, of Islamabad, should make the key.
Right, but
Pakistan is indispensable as a player in Afghanistan, no doubt about that.
Yeah,
right, regardless of being player, what you were saying, and that was the nub of the problem, influence in Afghanistan. Is influence more important than human lives?
very true.
It's hard to tell. I think that it depends on really how this influence is used, and it's a very delicate issue. I think that no one should push Taliban, just insisting that Taliban separates itself from its fundamental ideology and its principles. It's not possible. And if Taliban, even if Taliban is ready to do that, it means that it will be replaced by other fundamentalist groups, which is definitely not what the international community should be interested in. So my take is that there should be some red lines, but these red lines should be based on the current political realities. Taliban will be there. Taliban will not change fundamentally, and we'll have to deal with Taliban as it is.
Andre, today I was at the Foreign Office when the delegation of the Afghanistan, it reached Foreign Office of Pakistan. With them, there was this very young man, around 25, 26. He was very well educated, and of course, he's a journalist. And while talking to him, he said to me something very important, and I want to ask you about it. He said to me that fair enough, if the Western world has some scores to settle with the Afghanistan, with the Taliban, then they will be, having other instances as well coming in the future. But why not they just sit and think about the people of Afghanistan rather than just trying to settle their scores with the Taliban? This is what he asked me, and I had no answer to it. What would you like to reply to him?
Well, I think that generally that's the right approach, but Taliban should also cover its part of the distance. It means that Taliban should demonstrate that it might be an efficient operator of international assistance. It might be a fair distributor of funds and food and medicines which come to the country. So Taliban has to demonstrate that they can do more than just winning the country. They should demonstrate that they can manage the country, and that is probably even more difficult than winning the war.
And I get that comment. I get that opinion. Taliban should actually be flexible. I've been actually calling for that as well. But my concern is, if you are an Afghan citizen who is exposed to the cold, to the hunger, to the homelessness, and COVID-19 still is a factor. And you haven't brought Afghan Taliban into power. Should you suffer because both sides are not actually going to concede at all?
Excellent question.
No, absolutely. I think that, as always, the Afghan people are caught in the middle of these geopolitical machinations. I mean, both the Taliban and the international community, particularly the West, have been very uncompromising in the sense that the international community has said that unless X, Y, and Z happens, unless the Taliban does X, Y, and Z, the sanctions are going to stay in place. Whereas the Taliban has said that the Taliban has refused to make the types of changes that would allow many of the sanctions to be eased. And if the Taliban were to announce that all girls could go back to school, that could ease sanctions. If the Taliban announced the appointment of several non-Taliban leaders to some key government roles, that could ease sanctions. Unfortunately, this intransigence on the part of both the Taliban and the international community hurts the Afghan people the most, and that's really the tragedy of this story, for sure.
But this is, of course, something that puts to question whether or not the expectations from the Taliban, both in terms of the kind of changes that they require, the international community requires from the Taliban regime, and both in terms of the time that has been given for them to make those changes, is perhaps too high. Do you think that there is perhaps too much pressure on the Taliban, a regime that is just coming to terms with running a state, with transforming its position from a jihadist group to a state government, dealing with the situation in terms of terrorist groups also springing up in the country, with commitments coming in from the international community of inclusivity and changing the way that the Afghans have been looking at these issues and whether or not they are on the same page as well. All of these things require a very long-term change. Is that time or margin being really given to the Taliban regime? Do you think the expectation is too high, or is it not, Mr. Andre?
Well, I wouldn't say it's an issue of not giving the Taliban enough time to make these changes. I quite frankly think that it's a misplaced expectation that the Taliban would ever make these changes, because as I think was mentioned before, the Taliban is not going to change its fundamental ideology, and that includes the way that it views the issue of women. I mean, who knows? Maybe it would eventually want to say that there will be universal education rights for girls, and particularly older girls, but I wouldn't count on that. And I think that means that the international community just has to accept that in the immediate term and look beyond that to focus on addressing the humanitarian crisis. Because if you just sit waiting for the Taliban to make changes to its fundamental policies that it's not going to make, well, what's that going to mean? It means that the country, that Afghanistan, would just collapse economically, and as we had noted before, the Afghan people will suffer the most. I just don't think it's right to think that keeping these sanctions in place for a long enough time will eventually cause the Taliban to change its ways. I mean, if you look at the scholarship, the literature on sanctions policies, typically it doesn't work. It's very rare when it works. It ends up helping the regimes on the receiving end of them more than anything else, and the people are the ones that suffer the most from the impact of those sanctions. I'm not saying that sanctions should be removed right now, but I think it's important for the West to be clear-eyed about this and acknowledge the fact that there's a good chance that this hardline policy is not going to work.
Right. That is correct. But Andre, actually this takes me back to two interviews. One of Pakistan's NSA, where he says that should you be punishing 40 million people for the faults of 30 people? And on the other side, I saw another interview by Zalmi Khalilzad, where he says that Taliban are trying to actually implement some kind of reforms. And they have actually introduced education for girls in at least 12 districts. So do you think that this can be the foundation for any kind of solution, Andre?
I think that it is probably too little to lift sanctions, but I think that one should consider introducing sanction waivers, especially on humanitarian assistance. Maybe these waivers should be temporary, and we should introduce them and see how it works. But given the gravity of the situation and given the difficulties that the Taliban faces and uncertainties about what might happen in Afghanistan within even next couple of months, I think we should give Taliban the benefit of the doubt. And probably the United Nations could make exceptions for certain types of assistance that are now not allowed to be rendered to Afghanistan.
And if there can be, temporary waivers, can't there be a temporary recognition?
Well, I'm not sure that recognition is that important. I think it's important to keep channels of communication open and to be
an element, a government in power, and most of the people don't see them, right? You can make it conditional, but at this moment, Afghanistan doesn't have any access to UN. It doesn't have any access to most of the world bodies. Why not grant 3 months, 6 months conditional, recognition where they can sit, but they can be booted out whenever you want?
Well, I think that if there is a common position of major regional players, especially countries around Afghanistan, it would be better to go ahead with the collective recognition rather than to do it on individual basis. That would definitely give more leverage to the international community in dealing with Kabul.
Will that actually really make a difference in terms of the humanitarian assistance that we keep talking about right now? Michael, do you think that this is something that is going to make a stark difference in whatever help is needed in Afghanistan?
Sorry, can you repeat the question? I missed it.
The issue of recognition at the moment, do you think that will really make a difference in terms of the humanitarian assistance that we're looking for as the most urgent step? Do you think that the matter of recognition will have any major difference?
No, I don't. As I said before, I think the issue of recognition is in some ways irrelevant, immaterial to the current debate, just because the world has concluded that there's a lot that it can do in terms of engaging with the Taliban and devising strategies for responding to the humanitarian crisis without actually recognizing the Taliban. And I really think that no country is going to be ready to recognize the Taliban, no matter what happens with the humanitarian crisis, until there's more assurances about security and more assurances about the Taliban's ability to actually consolidate its power. So I think the focus is on the immediate term, the next few weeks, the next few months, doing whatever is possible to ease the crisis. And the Taliban has shown its own willingness to engage with the world without receiving recognition from any country. So yeah, I think that the issue of recognition is not really an important one, quite frankly, in the immediate term right now.
And Michael, I totally see your point, and I'm not pushing for any kind of recognition. The reality is platforms actually matter. And the fact is that on 15th, Afghanistan's ambassador to the UN actually stepped down. So at this moment, there is an empty chair. And while everyone is talking, shouldn't anybody who actually wields power in Kabul have any voice at the UN at all? Should other countries be deciding the fate of Afghanistan at this moment?
Right. Well, I mean, I think, yeah, clearly, if the UN were to say that the Taliban could have a representative at the UN, that would essentially be recognizing the Taliban regime, which the UN, I don't think, would be willing to do unless there's a consensus, unless you start to have countries individually recognize the Taliban. The UN will take the lead of, the UN countries would take the lead of individual decisions of the member states of the UN. Now, it is significant that the OIC has allowed the Taliban foreign minister to participate representing Afghanistan in the summit, which I think shows again the advantages of the OIC in this context. Now, should we suggest that the OIC countries, by allowing the Taliban foreign minister to attend the summit, does that mean that the OIC countries are recognizing Afghanistan, the Taliban? Perhaps yes. I think you could argue that many countries in varying ways have offered de facto recognition to the Taliban government, including the U.S. The fact that senior U.S. officials, including Tom West, who's at the OIC summit, have engaged directly and negotiated with the Taliban. But I think in terms of formal recognition, that's just not going to happen anytime soon. De facto is a lot different than formal in this context, I think.
Michael, when we talk about the word inclusiveness, what should we grab it out of it? When we say that there should be an inclusive government of Afghanistan, should we see the previous regime as well joining hands with the Taliban and making an inclusive government, or they should be from a different ethnically they'll be different, and sects that could be different?
Yeah,
what do we take out of it?
Define inclusivity.
I think that what the ideal notion of inclusivity here would not be bringing back members of the former regime. They're essentially radioactive. No one wants to see them anywhere, particularly operating with the Taliban. The Taliban would never allow for that, and that would be quite okay with the international community. I think the idea of inclusivity here is to bring in some non-Taliban officials, perhaps those that had served earlier in the post-Taliban era, like those that had been close to Hamid Karzai or something like that. But I think that really the broader goal is to have qualified, competent, experts that could serve as technocrats, as economists in this government who are not members of the Taliban, because that would help everyone. If you have people that actually have experience dealing with policy challenges, as opposed to the Taliban, which has no real governance experience, that would be really helpful because that could put the Taliban government in a better position to respond to the humanitarian crisis. And that would also help the Taliban because the world would see that as a good thing, that the Taliban is willing to let people that are not members of the Taliban operate on high levels. I think that's what the world is looking for. No one wants people close to Ghani to come back. Certainly the issue of ethnic diversity within the government would be appreciated, but I think that many people recognize, unfortunately, that that's not realistic at this point.
Andre, I want to ask you something regarding the issue of humanitarian aid and the fact that this is something that needs to be the topmost priority at the moment. And earlier we were discussing that is there anything more important than saving human lives? And we've seen repeatedly that almost everything seems to be more important than saving human lives. And it's something convenient to talk about as to how this should be a top priority. But the fact of the matter is that we've seen so many situations all over the world which have gone through worse situations, and they have been largely ignored based on other interests. And if we know that, then perhaps this strategy of putting forward the issue of humanitarian assistance being the topmost priority and pushing states that they should be helping may not be the right one. Perhaps the interests or the issues that are of actual concern to specific countries, perhaps the issue of refugees, for example, or other interests are the ones that need to be addressed or perhaps need to be spoken about. Do you think that this is something that is lacking in how we're putting forward this issue or how this issue is being discussed at large in the international community? Because talking about shoulds and what needs to be the priority in terms of humanitarian assistance, we all know that's not the case. So why are we even talking about that?
Well, first of all, let me say that we should not underestimate the resilience of the Afghan society. It is used to hardships, and I don't think that it will be the end of the world, even if the amounts of humanitarian assistance are not adequate to the needs of the country. But I think that what we should do, and this is really important, we should keep in mind the link between humanitarian assistance on the one hand and many other problems that can emanate from the territory of Afghanistan. If there is shortage of humanitarian assistance, we are likely to see larger waves of refugees getting out of the country. If there is a shortage of humanitarian assistance, the odds are that some regions of Afghanistan will be more vulnerable to the influence of fundamentalist groups like ISIS, Khorasan, or Al-Qaeda. So humanitarian assistance is not charity. It is something that the international community should do on the basis of its own interests, if the international community does understand these interests.
Andre, now we have a situation, and you have talked about ISIS Khorasan as well, and right now what we're seeing is Taliban are actively fighting against ISIS Khorasan. In this course, if the Taliban, they need assistance from the neighboring countries, especially your country, of course you have terrorism concerns as well that might originate from Afghanistan, and if Taliban are fighting against ISIS Khorasan, should Russia assist Taliban against the terrorism?
I think it should. I think it's not just Russia, but all neighboring countries should render any assistance they consider appropriate to help Taliban in fighting specifically ISIS-K. And we can discuss the forms and the scale of this assistance, but I think it is in their best interest to assist Taliban, because any alternative to Taliban is likely to be worse than Taliban. This is a grim reality, but this is what we have right now in Afghanistan.
Right. And earlier, Andre, you actually brought up a word called resilience. It is a beautiful word, but it is a word, right? Andre, Michael, Faisal, Sana, it was a 20 years war. And I mean, in that we saw an entire generation being born and growing up.
Yeah.
And what I tell you, what is eating me at this moment? Well, we can say that the people are very resilient. At that time, when the Afghan Taliban took over, a lot of people actually left their country and they went abroad. But there are people that I know, I have certain students, girl students there as well, who could not leave, and they might be going through this harsh winter, poverty, food shortages, medicine shortages. It keeps on eating me. I don't know how would you actually come to peace with it. The question at this moment, is it not, whether call it survivor's guilt or whatever, that you and I are sitting comfortably here and they go through hell?
We'll just take last comments from Mr. Michael before we end the show because we're out of time. Michael?
You know, I think that what Farrukh said was absolutely true. But just one final note to pick up what Andre had said about ISK. I think that we can't forget that. ISK is now the main security threat in Afghanistan, and it will pose a threat to these aid workers on the ground. And so that's another reason why it is important to leverage this consensus, one of the few areas of consensus within the region and the world about the need to go after ISK. The Taliban is doing it. It poses a threat to Afghans, but it also poses a threat to all of these aid workers, including especially international aid workers that are trying to deliver this much needed assistance and will be very vulnerable. So I think that we can't forget the ISK factor in this broader discussion.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Michael Kugelman and Andrei Kortunov, for joining us. The transmission continues. We'll just take a short break for the headlines, and we'll be back with more guests in the studio to talk about the OIC Special Foreign Ministers Conference. Of course, it's been happening and is being hosted by Pakistan tomorrow. Very important for Afghanistan and for Pakistan as well.